Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. We're here today with Bhante Sanathavihari, who's staying here for a few months. And my name is Bhante Suddhaso. And this morning we'll be talking a bit about mindfulness, in particular what mindfulness is and what it isn't, the difference between Buddhist mindfulness and secular mindfulness, and working on addressing some of the common misunderstandings or misconceptions about what mindfulness means in a Buddhist context and how that is or is not relevant to the broader discussion on mindfulness happening these days. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll invite Bhante Sanathavihari to start the conversation. So we'll pay homage to the Buddha first. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassam bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, Bhante, if you'd like to get us started on the topic.
Thank you, Bhante. When Bhante mentioned the subject yesterday of this talk, I was happy because it's something that I've dedicated a lot of time to studying for many years. I came into mindfulness and to Buddhism through a very traditional path, but I found that most people came from a more secular path, and I didn't really understand it. So I wanted to take some time to kind of see what they were talking about. So I've dedicated many years to understanding the secular, non-traditional mindfulness culture or dimension. And I was just surprised of how many incongruencies there is. It's just like mindfulness means whatever you want it to mean. It's just anything goes. And there's a beautiful article that came out many years ago called The Mindful Hype. And here many scientists and researchers and people involved in mindfulness kind of felt like the media was portraying mindfulness as something that it's not. So they took it upon themselves to write this article and kind of talk about the problems about mindfulness. That he says, like, you read 10 different articles and everyone describes mindfulness differently, and each practice that they're using is different. Even the mechanisms which they're talking about, like they could say mindfulness means this, and these parts of the mind are working. In another article, it says mindfulness means this, and other parts of the mind are working, and the way they practice it. And then they talk about mindfulness as like a meditation, or mindfulness as a state of mind, or in general, kind of like philosophy. Oh, a mindful way of being. So it's really all over the place, and there's no real consensus about it. I mean, most of the time when you hear explanation of mindfulness, usually the default one is the John Kabat-Zinn one from MBSR, the kind of non-judgmental awareness, being in the present moment. But you'll notice that, that one keeps getting tweaked. It gets tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked until sometimes it becomes something completely unrecognizable. And even that definition is kind of unrecognizable, not recognizable to us. It's kind of like, so I guess, yes, kind of something like that. But I think the most problematic part about this whole mindfulness thing is how it's been, been taken over for like profit, capitalism involved in this mindfulness project. To me, that's been the most problematic, because I'm so sympathetic, and I do think that anything that we can do to alleviate people's pain, we should do it, regardless of where it comes from or anything. But how it's been taken out of this very niche initial approach of like helping people with chronic pain to now, like, mindfully using drugs and mindful sex and mindful shooting for military people. And it's just, I think that's the most problematic one, where it becomes like a michasati, and it's not really dedicated towards helping people in the sense of alleviating pain, but just helping people get more delusional, feeding more of their greed, feeding more of their anger, right? And based on like productivity and exploiting people. How can we exploit people more? How can we suck more out of them? By providing mindfulness to them. And once you start looking at the research of, like, even for like these clinical studies, you'll see that it's like, it's not what we think it is when we read these articles and we see in the news all these amazing, how it's portrayed that all these mindfulness interventions are so amazing. They're just another option. If you compare them to like CBT, especially when it comes towards mood disorders or anxiety disorders, you pretty much get the same results, and there's a lot more evidence for CBT. So this kind of secular mindfulness approach, even for therapeutic purposes, is not this miracle drug or something that works in all cases, or that supersedes whatever we have right now. It's just something else. I mean, there's only one little niche where I've seen that it kind of outperforms, which is helping people with relapse, like from depression, preventing relapse. But outside of that, there isn't. It's not what we see in these kind of like clickbait articles that come up on your newsfeed, or when you see like on your Facebook, mindful this or 5 mindful steps to help you live a better life, and things like that. All of that kind of stuff is just fluff. It's just woo, actually, to get you to click and to pay the advertisers on those websites. That's pretty much is what it's for. Mindfulness is just a popular word that people can use in order to get you to click. There's this amazing study that came out not too long ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, by Mark Williams, G.H., where he did a comparative study of mindfulness-based cognitive training. And then he did the same thing, but he just took out the mindfulness element to help people with anxiety disorders. So everything was the same in both groups, except they took out mindfulness. And guess what? They got the same results. So whether mindfulness was in the intervention or not, people got the same benefit. I mean, the statistics were almost virtually the same. There was just a little tiny difference for people who had trauma, who had experienced trauma. They got a little bit more of a boost from the mindfulness aspect, but it wasn't like, wow, amazing statistic. Maybe it's just some other thing that we don't know about that's going on. Here this is only one of many articles where it proves that, this kind of mindful hype is really just that. It's just a hype. When you look at the evidence, it doesn't really show to be something that stands out of what we already have. It's more about the name. The name itself is what's getting people to try it and getting people excited. Just kind of like you see like Zen bar, or Zen restaurant, or Zen lab, or Zen, the word Zen is just used to catch people. So mindfulness has become something like that. And then, Bhante, I also find it kind of ridiculous how they say, like, it's like in these kind of secular places where they emphasize the secularity of it, but then at the same time, they want to kind of like get the benefits of the Buddha. So you'll see like a Buddha statue, or they'll be like, oh, my, this is secular. You don't need to be Buddhist, but my teacher was Thich Nhat Hanh. And, so it's kind of like they want it both ways. Like, oh, this is not religious. This is completely secular. You don't need to be a Buddhist, but, it is from a long tradition. I follow this long tradition, and my teacher was this famous monk. And look at me, and you always see the pictures of them like with their legs crossed and trying to give the facade of like being very Buddhist and being very traditional, but at the same time, it's not, So they kind of want to have it both ways. You see this contradiction all the time in these kind of secular mindfulness, which to me, it appears like, well, it's really just about becoming famous and making money, because you're just doing whatever you can to get people's attention, and if saying that it's secular gets you more attention and more money, that's what you're going to say. And if saying that, your teacher was Goenka Mahasi Sayadaw or Thich Nhat Hanh, highlighting that part is going to get you more people to watch and get more money and get you more famous, then, well, that's what I'm going to say. And if something else comes along, then I'm going to say that too. Whatever it takes to increase my own fame and prestige and monetary gains. But yeah, I mean, I could talk about all these. I got all these presentations and articles that I've written on this subject, but I think just to keep it like very general, those are the kind of things that came to mind, Bhante, when we talk about the current environment of mindfulness. It's just a facade. It's just a show. It's smoke and mirrors.
Maybe if you could talk a bit about what mindfulness is in a Buddhist context. So in Buddhism, what do we mean by mindfulness? Now that you've spoken a bit about what's going on outside of Buddhism, if you could say a bit about what we mean when we talk about mindfulness and how it fits into the Buddhist path.
Yes. So I think to me the most important, or the part that we need to highlight about Buddhist mindfulness is that it's not a thing in and of itself, like separate from the path. So I think that's like something that distinguishes it very much from like the secular one, where it's just like, we're just going to get this thing and just only use this one thing. Where in mindfulness, sati, or samasati, is part of the Noble Eightfold Path, So it's contextualized in this rich practice, where it's not just something for like therapeutic, my own benefit. And the Buddhist path, it's one part of many that we need in order to proceed. And I think that's probably the most important part that we need to recognize, that it's one of many practices, and it falls under the meditation. Usually when we talk about like sila, samadhi, panya, or we talk about like dana, sila, bhavana, you'll see that it's not even highlighted there. We don't even hear the word sati there. It's integrated into this practice. And really, when we talk about sati, developing sati, at least, we're talking about the practice of satipatthana. So in Buddhism too, we have both sati as like a mental factor, as a state of mind, right? And we also have it as like, something to develop as a practice, like in the practice of satipatthana. So here I think the most important thing is we focus on how sati contributes to all the other factors of the path. And when we look, especially when it comes to awakening, we look at the Sattva-bhujangas, we see that it's just the beginning. It's just like the first thing, right? And I was reading something from Bhante Sujato, I believe, where he says his understanding of like the practice of satipatthana is like where you already have to kind of come in with some sati in order to practice it, So it's the practice of satipatthana or anapanasati is not really like a focus completely on the development of just sati and like getting really good at being mindful, but it's something that you already kind of have, and then satipatthana helps you develop all the other 7 factors of awakening. So I think it's also important to distinguish from the secular perspective and the Buddhist perspective that at least in the suttas, sati is just really the beginning of the practice of satipatthana. It's not like you just only cultivate that and not anything else, because in this, comparing it to the secular style, it seems like, we're just going to be mindful and non-judgmental and not do anything else. We're just going to sit there and like, be stoned out or whatever it is, right? Like be lobotomized and just don't have any discernment. Just whatever arises and let it pass. But when we look at the Sattva-bhujanga, what comes after sati is like Dhammavichaya, right? So there's some discernment that comes right after it. It's not just to be non-judgmental. Sati serves a purpose to be able to distinguish between the kusala and akusala. Sati is important because it helps us realize what's going on, what's for our benefit and what's for the benefit of others, what's for the detriment and the detriment of others. So sati really has a very deep moral implication. It's to help us be more moral, to help us practice more sila, to help us be able to discern what is right view and what is not right view. So sati is basically like this tool that we use in order to help us progress with the other 8 steps. And it's just really the beginning of the practice. And as we see, like especially from how I understand the early suttas, sati has like more of a neutral, right? The state of sati can be kind of neutral. You can use it for good things or bad things. Where I think nowadays, sati is seen as, always good. It's just always good to have sati. That's why you can use it to be like a sniper, because it's still a good thing, even if you use it to be a sniper or to do like unwholesome things. It's sati in itself is seen as the ends and not a means to an end. Where for us, I think sati is more a means to an end, which is to see things, anicca sanya, to see anicca, dukkha, anatta. So it's really serving us to help get that wisdom, to get the panya. And it's not just like, I just want to have sati for having sati. So Bhante, those are just some things that really quick came to mind, but Bhante knows more. So
yeah, well, I think like that's what you're pointing to there is really important. It's understanding that well, first off, mindfulness isn't just present moment awareness. If we look at the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha further explains that so mindfulness is, first off, yes, being aware of our experience, being aware of our physical and mental experience. But further, the Buddha says it's also being aware of the impermanence of that, aware of the arising and ceasing of physical and mental experience. So aware of the constant change, and aware of the conditional nature, the causal nature of those changes. And also practicing of non-attachment, of letting go, of relinquishment. So it's also incorporating the element of non-self, of seeing what's arising and ceasing as being not me and not mine, but and not substantial, not something real per se, but just some ephemeral moment of experience which appears and disappears. So this is actually a really important component of samma sati, is that it does contain that element of liberating insight. In that, again, we're not just trying to be aware, like this bare awareness, but we're trying to go one step farther. We're trying to challenge our underlying misconceptions about the world, our underlying misperception or distortion in our view of the world. So it's more than just an awareness of our experience, but it's also an effort to transform our experience from the delusional to the wise. So to transform it from this distortion of perceiving the world as composed of stable, ongoing objects, perceiving the world in terms of me and mine, in terms of self-identity, perceiving the world in terms of possession and acquisition. And instead, it's changing our relationship with the world. So through this clear awareness of body and mind as a basis, then we develop the awareness, the mindfulness of the impermanent and impersonal nature of those experiences. So this is this critical transformation in using samma sati. It's incorporating this wise recognition of the impermanent and impersonal nature of those experiences. Do you want to say a bit more about that, about using mindfulness as a wisdom practice or an insight practice?
Yes, Bhante, but I was thinking about this funny story that Ajahn Brahm talks about, like about mindfulness. He says, he gives the story about this lady, she's like the lady of the house, and she's going to leave the house for some time. And she instructs the servant, to be very mindful. When I'm gone, I want you to be very, very mindful of what happens. Okay. And he goes, yes. He tells her yes. And then she leaves, she goes on vacation, or she goes out for the day, and she comes back. And when she comes back, she noticed that everything's missing in the house, right? Like they were robbed. And she tells the servant, like, didn't I tell you to be mindful? And the servant's like, yes, I was mindful when they came in, mindful when they got the jewels, mindful when they got them and left, and mindful when they came back in and took the other stuff, right? So here we see just like being aware for just being aware's sake is not good enough. There was no discernment. There was no Dhamma Vichaya. There was no wisdom to be able to see what's beneficial or not. Just kind of like, I'm just going to be lobotomized right here and stoned out and just rest in this non-judgmental. No, we need to have this judgment, right? We need to have judgment. We don't berate ourselves or criticize ourselves or others, but we need to have this wisdom aspect, and we need to apply it into our practice. So when I heard Bhante Ajahn Brahm say this, I was like, yeah, really, that really points to, you know, the problems or the limiting factors, or what we're trying to use sati for. We're not just using sati as a way to escape from all these terrible, unpleasant feelings and symptoms, or what's going on in the world. It's not a form of escape or a way to numb yourself from the world, but it's a way to see the world more clear and to be able to engage in a more skillful way, you know, in a more moral way, for the benefit of oneself and others. And I think this whole thing of applying sati for to see things clearly is actually to help us change our behavior and change the way we speak and change the way we think. So if we're practicing sati and we notice that we haven't made any, if we're practicing mindfulness, you know, and we notice that we haven't made any lifestyle changes, that's pretty much evidence that it's not working. You know, that whatever you're doing, that's not sati, because sati, when you practice sati, you're confronted with the reality of things, and it's very uncomfortable, you know, and then you know, as a person, want to make a better world for yourself and for others. You realize that, and sati should actually be like a catalyst for like a revolution of your life. If it's not revolutionizing your life and the way you think and the way you speak and the way you act, then you need to find another way to practice. So I think really, when I think about sati, it's really the beginning of the path and a catalyst and for a drastic and dramatic change in our lives. And I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience. That's what happened with me. You know, I practice, and the more I developed sati, the more obvious things were. You know, that I couldn't keep following the patterns that I did, and that I needed to take up a Buddhist practice, and that I needed to take sila very serious, and I need to practice dana, and I need to study the teachings of the Buddha. And then eventually, I need to become a monk and renounce everything, right? So sati should be something that moves us towards awakening. And if you don't see that in your own sati practice, in your own practice of mindfulness, you might want to reconsider, you know, how you're practicing it, or what you think sati is. You might have a completely distorted view of what mindfulness means.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you were saying earlier, it's really important to remember that samma sati, or right mindfulness, is one of the 8 factors of the Eightfold Path. And actually, that practice of sati, of mindfulness, is one, it's meant to support practicing the other 7 aspects of the path, and also the other 7 aspects of the path support the practice of mindfulness. So each of the aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path all support each other. So all of these 8 aspects of the path support each other and fit together into this one interlocking system, where each one of the 8 components is irremovable. They all support each other. So why do we practice sammasati? Why do we practice right mindfulness? Well, it's so that we can practice right effort more easily. So right effort is the effort to be aware of unwholesome mind states when they're arising, and to stop them from arising, and to try to eliminate them if we notice they're already present. It's the mindfulness of being aware of whether or not there's wholesome states in the mind, and making an effort to produce them and maintain them. So it's meant to support the practices of right speech, of right action, of right livelihood. So being clearly aware of our decisions of body and speech, of physical and verbal behaviors. So being clearly aware of what we're going to say, and whether it's coming from a wholesome place or an unwholesome place. Being clearly aware of the actual effects of our actions as well. So constantly training ourselves to observe the consequences of our decisions, so that we can be more careful about making more wholesome decisions, more productive in the moral sense. So not necessarily productive in the capitalist sense, but productive in the moral sense of trying to do things which cause less harm and bring more benefit into the world. Again, mindfulness always fits into the other aspects of the path as a critical supporting component. because without mindfulness, it's very difficult to practice the Noble Eightfold Path. But if we just take mindfulness by itself, well, it's just one of the 8 ingredients. It's insufficient in and of itself. In and of itself, it isn't actually much of anything. It's like having eyes. Like, well, you have eyes, okay, and what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do with your eyes? Are you going to use your eyes to so you can see what good you can do in the world, or are you going to use your eyes to aim your rifle? Like, what are you going to do with your eyes? Are you going to use your eyes to look for homeless people to offer food to? Or are you going to use your eyes to look for houses to rob? Like, what are you going to do with your eyes? So eyes in and of themselves are morally neutral, as Venerable was saying. And it's the same with our mindfulness practice. The question is, what are we doing with our mindfulness? Are we using it in a way which is making us better people, wiser people, kinder people? Are we using our mindfulness in a way that supports the practice of awakening, supports becoming more Buddha-like? So this is what's important to consider. And I think at this time we can, unless you have some other comments, we can go ahead and see if there's any questions or comments from the audience here.
Bhante, I just wanted to share this fact that came to mind when they were studying the kind of adverse effects of the way people are practicing mindfulness now. Actually, they saw that in many cases, it promotes narcissism and it promotes it reduces positive affect, which is like compassion, empathy, and sympathy. So people actually end up becoming very stoic, very cold, very self-centered, which is like the opposite of what mindfulness is intended to do. And I think that just shows, like, when you decontextualize something, it can go completely on the other side, and it's taking them more towards delusion, greed, and hatred instead of freeing us from greed, hatred, and delusion. So that's something, very interesting about the way that mindfulness is being shown now, that it actually it's pushing people, propelling them more towards delusion than getting them away from it.
Yeah, actually, your point about it making people more self-centered, I think, is actually really important, because this, again, if one is taking mindfulness out of the Buddhist context, then one can easily think, well, I'm just fixating on me and my needs and my truth and my story and my experience, and yeah, you're becoming more mindful of your experience. That's true, but also that constant fixation on me then can naturally lead to a strengthening of self-obsession, self-attachment, which is actually the core of all of our suffering. All of our suffering arises from self-centeredness. So whereas in the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, we're practicing self-awareness so that we can change our unwholesome behaviors, and also so that we can clearly see the impersonal nature of this experience. Recognizing that this body mind is not me, it's not mine, it's not who I am. It is just a temporary natural phenomenon, which ultimately is not personal. So if we're practicing mindfulness in a Buddhist context, then it should actually be reducing our self-centeredness, reducing our narcissism, reducing our fixation on me and mine. So we can go ahead and see if there's any questions or comments here. Well, first off, hello to all the people who have been joining in online. So hello to Louisa, R. Woods, Kit, Manal, Richard, John, Jayanta, Edward, Suman, Hai Eng, P. Lee, Wen, Scott, Vo, Yankee, and Charles Lee. Hello, everyone. And I see a couple of questions and comments. First off, so Hai Eng has a question about pilgrimage to Buddhist holy places. That's a bit off topic, so maybe you can bring that to Monk Chat this evening. So Monk Chat is our chance to take any kind of questions on any topic, but this morning we're talking about mindfulness. So pilgrimage we can talk about this evening. And Luisa says, I feel like people in the West are picking and choosing what they want out of Buddhism and wondering why they're still suffering. Yeah, so as I had said recently, the Eightfold Path is like a recipe for a cake. It has 8 ingredients. So in order to actually get the cake to turn out correctly, then you need to follow the recipe and use all the ingredients, and you need to prepare them in the way described in the recipe. But if you look at the recipe and you're like, well, I don't need this and I don't need that, and I can leave this out, and that's not important, and I'm just going to fixate entirely on this 1 or 2 ingredients, well, then you don't have a cake. So if a cake calls for flour and eggs and sugar and baking powder and whatever else, and you're like, well, baking powder is the important one, so I'm just going to have lots and lots of baking powder, and so then you call your friends over to have chocolate cake and you just give them a big bowl of baking powder. Are you making cake? Are you serving cake? Are your friends going to be happy? Is anybody going to get any benefit out of this? Absolutely not. On the other hand, if you leave the baking powder out when you make the cake, then that's going to be a problem. So it is an important ingredient, but it's not self-sufficient. It's only relevant in terms of the context of having all of the other ingredients in place. So this is exactly the phenomenon that you're describing here. So if one starts cherry picking Buddhism, then that's like cherry picking a cake recipe. You're not going to wind up with anything useful. At best, you're going to wind up with something that's just kind of pointless and not particularly enjoyable. Worst case scenario, you might actually wind up hurting yourself or hurting other people, or both. Do you have any other comments you want to say on that?
No.
Okay. And so P. Lee says, I've heard sati translated as attention and satipatthana as introspection. What do both Bhantes think about these translations? What do you think?
Bhante is the expert in this.
I think both of those translations are pretty bad, to be honest. I mean, translating sati as attention, I mean, maybe it's somewhat okay. Translating satipatthana as introspection, not really. I mean, kind of. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I don't think those are particularly good, to be honest. I mean, they're kind of vaguely okay, but you then have to explain what you mean by those terms. So it's not wrong per se. I just don't think it's particularly good. So my thoughts anyway. Yeah. Okay. And that's the last question. So if that's it for this morning, we can go ahead and conclude it this time. So we'll wrap up at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And you can join us this evening for Monk Chat, where you can ask any questions related to any topic within the field of Buddhism, and we'll do our best to answer. So we'll see you next time.